Because I think what engaging with history and politics requires you to do is to really inhabit the mindset of someone else and someone who interprets the world really differently from you. Because if you're going to win a debate or think about how to form something, you really have to be able to see the world from another person's perspective.
Podcast Junkies episode 210. Welcome back. I'm your host, Harry Duran. In case you missed last week's episode, you might want to check that out, especially if you're a traveler or a fan of traveling stories. Scott Gurian, host of Far From Home, did not disappoint. Fascinating episode telling about his trip across Morocco and how he's continuing to do the podcast even after a lot of experience in the radio world. And I learned a lot from that episode, and it was just fascinating to be placed in some of those spaces and events and countries that he was referencing on the show, which was fascinating. So make sure you check that out, episode 209. This is the first episode of the new year, 2020. Happy 2020 to all. Lots of things going on. One of the things that was important for me is this idea of theming my year. I've heard it done before. I've kind of haphazardly done it in the past. And I'm just more cognizant and more focused about doing it this year. And so I spent a couple of days in the end of December, more than I probably ever have, thinking about the new year and planning some themes. And the word that I came up with is simplify. And so everything that I do for this podcast, for my business, FullCast, is all going to be about the concept of simplifying. So what I'm doing now is I'm asking myself as I do a task, as I work on something related to my business or even my personal life, I'm asking myself, is this going to make my life simpler or more complicated? So I invite you to share your theme if you've picked one for this year. Send an email to Harry at Podcast Junkies and let me know. I'd be happy and interested to hear what you guys have got in the works for 2020. And I'm sure there's been a lot of references made to this idea of 2020 vision and getting clarity for the next decade. So that's what I'm focused on this year. Once again, we are brought to you by the Scarlett 2i2 sound card by the wonderful folks at Focusrite. Shout out to Dan Hewley. Can't say enough good things about this sound card. Super clean preamps, which provide a clean boost to your sound. So I've used it both with the Samson Q2U microphone as well as the Shure SM7B, which is a bit gain hungry and definitely requires a clean sound card. So this is the new 3G, third generation sound card, and it's guaranteed to make your audio sound completely professional. This week, I get to speak to Amira Valliani. She's the CEO and co-founder of Glow.fm. Glow is a system for podcasters to be compensated for their podcast, similar to Patreon, but I think it now takes it to the next level because when you ask for support, which I've done in the past and I will do more consistently on this podcast, the mechanism for doing that is so seamless. It's amazing the experience that a listener gets. Simply click on the link in the show notes and you can test that out at the end of this podcast episode, and you'll be prompted to a screen within the browser of the podcast app to submit or donate a one-time donation or an ongoing donation to support the podcast. So she's really making it easy for podcasters to be compensated and for creators in general to be compensated for their art. And the discussion we had is really fascinating because she's got a really interesting background. She's traveled extensively. She's whip smart, and she has her finger on the pulse of what's happening in this industry. So we've been chatting for a while now, and we're good friends now, and we're hopefully going to be working on some things in the future. So stay tuned. This episode is also brought to you by FullCast, our full service done for you podcast production agency. If you need help starting a show or have some consulting questions related to your existing show, feel free to set up a free chat with me at fullcast.co/chat15. That's chat15. Make sure you stay to the end of the episode for this week's retention hashtag. But let's jump into this glowing conversation with Amira. So Amira Valliani, co-founder and CEO of Glow.fm. Thank you so much for finding the time to join us on Podcast Junkies.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's really good to be here, Harry.
So let's see. How did we get connected? We got connected through Ben. Is that right?
Yeah, Ben Gilbert, co-host of Acquired, and early customer and investor in Glow. And I think he chatted with you and put us in touch. He was like, you got to talk to Harry. And I am so glad he did.
Let's start with you and tech. What's your earliest memory of technology growing up?
Such a good question. So I was born and raised in Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in the Bay Area, and my dad, when he's an immigrant, he went to college in New York, and the day after he graduated from college, actually packed his car and drove out to Silicon Valley to pursue the dream. And So I was always surrounded by technology and entrepreneurship growing up. And so my earliest memory of technology, and I'm embarrassed I don't remember the name of the computer, but it was, early 90s. And I remember him and my brother, who's he's a little older, he's a technologist, hooking up the internet in our house and getting on there and being like, whoa, this is so cool. Like, look at this internet thing. And it was, old school, like giant computers. So I've been around technology or, sort of immersed in tech culture for a long time. And it really started with my parents, my background.
So early 90s, so that might have been Dell or Gateway 2000, or I remember those.
I think
direct mail was a big deal back then.
Yeah, I think it was Dell's, and my brother was a huge gamer, so he used to have these LAN parties, like all his friends come over, and I was the 6-year-olds who would crash their high school party and start playing like Doom and Warcraft with them. I once skipped Thanksgiving dinner because I was just so immersed in a Warcraft game. I think I was like 14. So that was sort of the scene.
Was that one of your favorite games, World of Warcraft?
This was before World of Warcraft. It was just Warcraft. I went through a phase. I was into Warcraft for a while, and then Grand Theft Auto. I'm not a huge gamer, but I definitely had some fun in high school with it.
Did you ever? I don't know if Warcraft was, because that was a little later. Because I got started in the Atari 2600 age. That's dating me. Like Texas Instruments was my first computer, and Tandy one. Yeah,
you're
Tandy
right.
1000.
The TI-83. This is my first experience coding. Like I don't remember. Man, Harry, you're such a good interviewer. I remember, having my TI-83 in high school, and programming those like really, really basic sort of text-based games. And I think there was a form of Tetris on it that I was playing around with back then. So that was a lot of fun.
Well, it was interesting because it was more theater of the mind. Like Zork was a big game, Adventure. There was a couple of one that were literally just text-based games, and you would be like, you enter a castle, there's a door on the left and a door on the right. Like it was just like lines of text, and you'd just be like, oh, what am I going to do? And then, but your mind is like, it's like you're reading like one of those adventure books, and it was fascinating. Zork was the biggest one. I got to look it up. They probably have it available now, like for the iPhone. Like it's crazy, but it's fascinating because the graphics are completely on the other side, where they look like movies now. When I see the promos for some of these games right now, I can't tell if it's like a real person, like a CGI, like with these commercials.
Yeah, you're right. I remember the text-based games, and it was all about like some kind of scary room. That was fun.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about what it was like growing up, having this opportunity to connect with technology at such an early age, but also the fact that you were a female. And I imagine were there a lot of your girlfriends in school who were just as well versed, or maybe in Silicon Valley things were different. So I'm just curious about what that was like growing up.
Honestly, I think growing up, I sort of took a connection to technology for granted. And what I was really craving was something different. When you grow up surrounded by technology and surrounded by entrepreneurship and people who are being scrappy, Stanford and Berkeley are right in your backyard, Apple is across the street. You don't necessarily think about something different or something you need to learn. It's what you already know. It's sort of what you're born into. So at a young age, I was always really interested in computer science, and I guess I took it for granted that I was a woman interested in technology. Although, a fun fact, and not to humble brag, I think I was one of 90 women in California the year I took it to get a 5 in the AP computer science exam. So this was early, and now I'm sure there were only 900 people taking it, but it was early, and it was very much just a part of what I thought the world was. And so when I was thinking about where I want to go next, I was sort of like, all right, this technology thing is cool. Like I didn't think of it as a thing. It was just part of my life. I really want to go out and explore the rest of the world. And so I went out to the East Coast for college. I moved out to the Northeast, and I was really intrigued by the institutions that shape the world. So, what happens in government? What happens in all these Wall Street banks? Like, what are all these things I see in movies that seem so foreign to me that I just haven't experienced here? And I guess I always knew that technology was a really important driver of daily life. And for me, the thing I felt like I had to learn about and connect with was how everything happens outside the valley, or how people do in other places. I didn't really think of the valley as a thing, more so than, how do I double down on technology, or how do I connect with it more deeply?
This could be a wide range of options for you to choose from, but do you remember a book or a teacher or a class that shifted your worldview in terms of, like, there was a point, like, we all have that moment where we realize, like, the world is a bit different than we thought it was, or it's either bigger or it's more complicated than we think it is. And just as an example for me, I remember when I got to college and I was assigned the autobiography of Malcolm X, right? And I was just like, whoa, I didn't realize, like American history, like some of the stuff they don't teach you. And like when you're in grade school and you sort of learn some of these other books that teach you other aspects of what's happening in this country. And I'm just curious, because of some of the education you've received, if any of that happened with any of the materials you received as you were getting educated.
Yeah, there's so many. I've long been a big fan of history, like a student of history and a huge student of politics. And so for me, the first time I got to really engage with history and how government is formed was mind-blowing for me, because I think what engaging with history and politics requires you to do is to really inhabit the mindset of someone else, and someone who interprets the world really differently from you. Because if you're going to win a debate or think about how to form something, you really have to be able to see the world from another person's perspective. And so, the first couple of experiences that really did that to me was in high school. I had a teacher named Mr. Neer, who was my U.S. history teacher, who just did an incredible job of, he'd sort of get up every day in front of the class and he'd be like, all right, today we're talking about, the Battle of Concord. And he had this really amazing way of being able to say, like, yeah, and the British, like, they were caught with their pants down. Like, this was crazy. And thinking about the British being caught with their pants down and having this image in your head of, like, I never thought of it that way. Like, I never thought of what it must have been like to inhabit the world of those soldiers. Or, and I could talk on and on about my history teachers. I had another one named Mr. Merrill, who I actually go back and talk to his class every year. But he would do a simulation where, like, one day a year, you walk in the class and he's doing the best job he can of simulating the environment of being on a slave ship.
Wow.
And so you walk into the classroom, and each person, there's masking tape on the floor. You're confined to this one little space. You're ducking the entire time. He's talking about topics that you might be discussing. And that stuff, when you're 12, 13, 14 years old, it's really striking to have to be forced to internalize what those things might have been like. And those are incredibly powerful experiences to me. And I think it's why I gravitate so much towards storytelling. I think so much of the world is about being able to tell a story and take someone else's experiences and communicate them in a way that is easy for other people to internalize. And I think that started with my interest in history.
That's fascinating. And the fact that your teacher was able to do that at such an early age, I would imagine left a pretty big impression on you. And there's something about doing it in a way that's experiential that obviously you still remember it to this point. So it had a lasting effect.
Yeah, I had brilliant teachers. I mean, the other thing he did is he actually got a cotton plant, and he would sort of hand out cotton with still seeds in it and say, like, all right, everyone go ahead and take the seed out of the cotton. And to have to imagine the fact of all day, every day, that being your job, and not your job, the thing you were being forced to do, is sort of revolutionary. When you're studying slavery, it takes something very abstract and turns it into something very, very personal.
So with all that, with all those amazing teachers you had, and as you were making your way through high school and through college, how many times did you change what it is you thought you wanted to do once you graduated?
Oh, I had no idea what I wanted to do in high school. I think the thing that always drove me was the need to make an impact. And I think something that's still true about me that I think, a lot of my family and friends sometimes have trouble interpreting, and I sift through is I care about making an impact on the world, and I think there's a lot of different paths towards doing it. And so I think my journey through high school and my journey through my career is what are the different levers I sort of uniquely can pull to help make an impact on something. And so in high school I spent a lot of time as an activist, and then that thread sort of continued through college, and then I went over to work in government after college for a bit. But what I realized when I was in government was I realized that my Silicon Valley background, even just being sort of on the margins of it, was actually quite unique in terms of how I thought about the power of technology. And so that's when I really started to think about how technology might be able to something that I could uniquely leverage to make an impact. And so when I was in high school, to answer your question, I wasn't thinking too hard about a specific career. I was thinking more about the problems in the world and getting obsessed with them, and I wasn't quite sure how to solve them. But I think those are the things that really capture my imagination.
Can you remember a time when that became something that was important for you, like this idea of making an impact? Like you don't have it, maybe you did when you were super young, but was there a time when you realized, or who was it that was an influence in helping you shape the idea of having an impact as something that was important to you?
I think it comes from two places. So I think one, I have a broad interest in making an impact on the world and leaving the world a better place than I found it. And then two is I do have a pretty deep sense of the need to serve our country and be a really good citizen in addition to just making an impact. And I think both of those really drive from my religious background. I'm not a super religious person, but I grew up Muslim, and I think a lot of the values that I inherited as a child come from that. And so in my mosque growing up, service is a really, really deep component of what's expected to, and it appears everywhere. We learn, in Sunday school, a lot of the amazing impact of our sort of religious leaders and our parents and the impact they made on the world. So, work in developing countries and what you can do to make an impact in places like Pakistan, parts of East Africa, Afghanistan. Those were things that they would talk about regularly in our mosques, and those were things that felt very visceral because of where our parents came from, right? My dad came from Pakistan, my mom came from East Africa. Like this idea of making impact where they came from was something that was regularly talked about and something that was seen as a part of your duty as just being a person growing up. So I think that's part one. It was just sort of always part of the dialogue. Part two, when it came to service, after September 11th happened, it really forced me to think deeply about what it meant to be Muslim and what it meant to be American, and an age that I think, people normally wouldn't be forced to think about if you didn't sort of have to go through that event as, an 11-year-old in America. And so it made me really interrogate deeply what parts of my religion were important to me and what parts of my country were important to me. And I think the values that I learned from being Muslim and the values I learned from being American are actually very similar. It's about, commitment to a diverse set of people and helping promote this idea that diversity is incredibly important, and something that when we work together, the yield is a better world, a stronger world, one where people cooperate, but also one where just more great stuff happens. And the commitment to those two projects to me seemed actually deeply overlapping. And I think that's when I was like, man, I feel really strongly about being an American. Like, this is an incredible project that I get to be a part of and have the opportunity to advance. So I don't know if those were the answers you were looking to for your questions, but I think if I think about the notion for an impact, that's where they come from.
How did what happened post 9/11 affect you and or your family or anyone that you were close to?
I think what happens when, you're 11 or 12 and you've just grown up, like your religion's what you know, right? Like I don't know if you're religious, Harry, but you grew up going to mosque, you grew up going to church, like it's not a thing. It's just what your family does on Fridays or Sundays, and you sort of show up. And being forced at a really early age to be told, oh, this thing that you're a part of is evil or under attack or responsible for this awful thing that happened to your family and your friends and in your country, it really it forced me to interrogate, like, what does it mean to be Muslim? And it helped me think about, first, like, how do I defend my religion, but also, how do I prod and figure out, like, the places where I can be true to both things? So in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, my family, and it's not a unique story, like, There's just a lot of fear. We were told when we went to mosque not to wear ethnic clothing. People were told to park across the street, not in the actual parking lot, so that their cars wouldn't get damaged. There was sort of this general message of don't act out, don't draw attention to yourself. And I think the number one lesson I learned through that process was, I think that's the wrong strategy. Like, it's so easy to be scared. But what happens is, look where we are. It's 18 years later, and Americans still have no idea what Islam is about. And the fear is worse. And the skepticism is worse. And what we should have been doing, I think, proactively is going out and telling our story and talking about the values that we preach, that I think are very American values, and finding ways to engage the community more and more. Now, it's very easy for me to say, I didn't have children. I was a child, right? Like, the instinct is to protect yourself and protect your flock. But I think that one of my main takeaways was, we were very scared, and we should have been more outgoing. The other thing it did is it really forced me to understand what Islam is and where I fit into the broader picture. So it really set off for me, I think, a lot of wanderlust. Like, I spent a lot of the next 15 years of my life investing in traveling, trying to learn a lot about the world. I've been to almost 60 countries today. I spent a lot of my time in college visiting different parts of the Muslim world and the world more broadly, and learning people's stories and learning about the different ways that people relate to religion, but relate to their country and relate to each other. And I think a lot of it fundamentally comes back to increasingly why I think the importance of a story is so critical, is probably shaped by that experience.
Yeah, I was in New York for 9/11. I experienced the whole thing. Wow. Yeah, and it had a very visceral reaction to it. And
what was its impact on you? Yeah.
It was so strange because I worked like 2 blocks away from it, and I was literally like heading out the door 8:45 in the morning because I would check the weather on News 1 before hitting the subway, which would take a 15-minute ride, and I'd be at work by 9. But the first one had crashed by that time. So when I turned on the TV, the first tower was already on fire. And so I lived in East Village, and I could look out my window and see the Twin Towers every morning. So I could literally like wake up in the morning and I see the Twin Towers. And so this morning I would look out and one of them was on fire. So I was watching the TV, which looks like a movie, and then I'd look out the window and I'd see like what was really happening. It was so bizarre. So we all ran up to the roof. It was like a 5-story building in the East Village, and we were just watching everything from the East Village, which is about 20, 30 blocks north. It was just like whole surreal. Someone pulled out a telescope, and at some point we were like looking, and we were just trying to figure out like, how are we going to get like firefighters, like whatever it was, 90 stories up there. We were just like going crazy, and then nothing happened, and then we went back down. Then the second plane hit, and then the second plane hit, and then we were like all like freaking out. Then we saw fighter jets flying overhead, and then at some point it was still burning. I went back down, and then they collapsed, and we were like, holy shit. And then we ran upstairs, and we just saw everything, and we were just imagining like how many tens of thousands of people just perished right there. It was bananas. Wow. The smoke made its way up to where we were, and then the next couple of days were so surreal. It was like Humvees in the streets. But it was interesting because I talk about this. I've talked about this a couple of times. That those couple of weeks, maybe a month or two after, there was a small town feel to New York City. Like literally, like we were all like, "Hey," like kind of you doing a small town howdy neighbor. Like like everybody was talking to each other. Everybody was asking, "How you doing? How you doing? How you doing?" Which you normally don't see in New York City. So yeah, it was interesting because I have coworkers at the time who normally show up earlier than me, and they literally like had gone out into the street to watch what was happening, and they had to like run back inside the building. And the building where I worked, the smoke went so high that it blacked out the windows. So it was just crazy, and a lot of people that were down there, obviously, yeah, they had to walk home. Some people took like 8-9 hours to walk home. So it was just a crazy. Yeah, I mean, obviously, it was a crazy day. But I'm always interested when I always hear people that reference it, like where they were and like what they were doing at the time, because it just fascinates me.
Wow, that must have been terrifying.
Yeah. Just not knowing what was going to happen, and you just keep hearing like it just kept getting worse and worse. And the Pentagon got hit. And now they're like, what's next? Like, what are they going to? Like, obviously, like everything's crazy. So now let's shift into you leaving college and hitting the workforce. Talk a little bit about the early first jobs you had.
I left college, and one of the first things I did was moved down to DC, and I got a job as an intern at the White House.
That's cool.
Which is an incredible experience. I was like, man, this is my life dream. And this was shortly after sort of the bottom of the 2008 crisis, and I was working on policy of the National Economic Council. I went to government and I had this incredible opportunity to serve, and it was capped at 6 months. And a couple months in, I said, this is incredible. And what I was really trying to figure out through that experience is a lot of people would knock working for the government, right? A lot of people say it's slow and people aren't very smart. And I was like, man, these perceptions are all wrong. Like, the people I work with, they're incredibly interesting. They're interested. It's fast paced. They're solving really difficult problems. They're some of the smartest people I've ever met. And man, are their hearts in the right places. And I said, I want to figure out how to stay here. So, I went out and tried to figure out how I could stay, serving, and ended up at the State Department, where I worked as a special assistant to one of then Secretary Clinton's right-hand aides. So I sort of worked in her Office of Policy Planning. I don't know if you ever watched The West Wing.
No, it's on the list. It's on the binge list.
Or maybe these like political dramas.
Well, I watched.
There's that person.
The same writer, so I'm familiar with the style. But the guy who wrote it's Sorkin, right?
Social Network, yeah. But maybe you've seen like...
And The Network. Have you seen is it on HBO? It was on HBO or Netflix, the series, The Network. It was about a TV station. Yeah.
Oh, I never watched it. But yeah, his style. But maybe you've watched like other political dramas, like Scandal or whatever. In these political dramas,
House of Cards.
There's the important person, sure. Yeah, House of Cards. There's the important person, and then there's the person who like follows that person around and tells them their schedule and like takes notes. And I was that person. I was the person who like followed the important person around and took notes. And it was just a really incredible experience to serve and sort of see how really smart people dealt with a lot of really tough problems in the world and get the chance to sort of contribute to that environment. And so, I sort of worked my way up to the chance to get to do some speech writing for then Secretary Clinton. And, one of the things that really struck me when I was there was I'd always known media was important, and I'd always known that the story that we tell the world is important. But man, I didn't realize how critical it was to be able to tell a story and communicate what you're doing in the world. Like, I think that's where I was like, man, media crafts so much of our social narrative and helps shape so much policy and what we decide to do as a country. This is critical. Like, we spent so much of our time thinking about, we have this policy decision. How is this going to play? How are we going to communicate this to the world? How are people going to interpret it that way? And it's very easy to think that stuff cynically, right? Like, what is the policy? Where are the talking points? But no, the talking points are actually a critical part of the policymaking decision, because if people don't understand what you're trying to do, the policy will often fail or not get implemented the way you want to.
Makes sense.
And so we spent a lot of time doing that. And after Secretary Clinton left, her staff left, I want to stay in government a little longer. So I got to go over to work at the White House on the National Security Council, where I worked on the team that decided how we discuss American foreign policy to the world and coordinated that entire apparatus, everything from sort of day-to-day talking points to our longer-term, what we call public diplomacy initiatives. And so those were my first couple of jobs out of college.
When did the entrepreneurial bug hit?
Yeah, I'd always had it. I just didn't think I realized it was very unique, going back to that sort of Silicon Valley background. And when I was in government, I've always been kind of a scrappy person, and I don't have a good habit of asking for permission. And I started to do things a couple of times, move a policy forward or investigate an issue, and I would get slapped on the wrist for it, and I was like, oh, there's a reason that I should not be risk-taking and going out to move the ball forward on a specific policy issue by myself as a 24-year-old in government, who's being trusted with the responsibility and aid. And what I realized is, one of the things I really excel at is going out to find scrappy ways to get done, seeing a problem, coming up with different solutions, experimenting. There's very little room for that when you're working on the National Security Council, for a good reason. But what I realized is, I have this entrepreneurial bug in me. I always took it for granted that it was an entrepreneurial bug. I thought it was sort of the way you did things. I'm realizing there's a difference between the way I tend to do things naturally and the way good policy is made and the way a good policymaking process works. And I started to think back to, my upbringing in Silicon Valley and what I learned from my dad and my mom, who's also a fantastic entrepreneur. And I said, I actually should be starting a company. I should be working in a much more entrepreneurial environment. But I didn't know what that meant. I didn't have any previous business training, really. And so I said, let me go off and figure out the best way to learn how to be an entrepreneur. And that's when I went to business school. And the thing I went to business school to do is, I knew I wanted to be an entrepreneur, but I didn't want to start just anything. I wanted to start something that I thought made the media environment work better because of what I had seen about how critical the media was to the functioning of our country. And so I went to business school and I said, I want to do something entrepreneurial, and I want to do something entrepreneurial that I think really contributes to a stronger media environment.
Was Glow your first entrepreneurial venture?
No. Glow was sort of the outbringing of a winding path of me learning about the podcast industry as a podcaster myself, as someone who helps sell ads for podcasts, really tried to strengthen this industry, and realizing that I think what we do at Glow is uniquely one of the best things that we can do to, I think, help put more money into the industry. So I went to business school. Like I said, I want to do something entrepreneurial, and I want to do something that made the media work better, and I didn't know what that meant. In my first year, I heard a podcast, and it was the startup podcast out of Gimlet. And I was like mind blown, fell in love immediately. I was like, I
a lot of us
empathy
had
for this guy.
that same reaction, yeah.
Absolutely incredible. And I was like, all right, this is the thing. Like, I got to learn more about this podcasting industry. So, I became obsessed. I went from 0 to listening to 3 or 4 hours of podcasts a day. My data went over the whole 9 yards. And I was like, all right, what's going on with this industry? How can I get involved? And as I started to look around, I was like, there aren't that many jobs in this space. And there's not that much clarity around how this industry works. And I said, all right, how can I do something interesting? And I had a few friends with podcasts. I said, can I go sell you ads? And so I ended up building out this podcast advertising business, thinking that I could help sort of work with podcast advertising. I simultaneously started my own podcast. I started a local news podcast about the city council election in my town. And I was working with a bunch of podcasters to sell ads. I learned a ton about the advertising ecosystem, and I'd also seen a bunch of podcasters get either frustrated by how the ecosystem worked or finding other ways to supplement their income from the advertising ecosystem. And I found myself in a similar spot where I had started a podcast, and I wanted to ask people to pay for it. Like I built an audience, and I didn't want to put the whole thing behind a paywall, but I said, there's really valuable content I can create for my community. I need to figure out how to turn this into a business. How do I do that? And I started feeling like a lot of the same pain points that a bunch of my clients on the advertising side had. And as I looked around, I realized, wow, there's no easy way for listeners to pay me directly for a thing. And what I had seen from all my other clients was they were hacking together solutions to collect payments from their listeners, either for content or to access to a community or to quarterly market reports, whatever it was, right? And I was like, I have this problem as a podcaster. All these other people I'm working with have the same problem. Maybe this is the problem I should be solving, not how do I get more advertising? Because a lot of people are working on how to get more advertising. It's still a problem, but there's a bunch of people there. But how do I make it easy for people to pay podcasters directly and even give them the option to gate content? So that's how I got to Glow. But that journey was, 3 or 4 years long.
As is the case with most entrepreneurs, right?
Of course, yeah.
What were some of the early challenges with Glow?
It's funny, like we're still early, so I'm like, what are our challenges today? I think it's funny how much the industry has changed in just the past year, because I think when I went out to podcast movement in 2017 and was starting to bounce this idea off people, they were intrigued, but they said, I don't know if anyone will ever pay for a podcast. And I sort of believed that there was a future where people might pay for podcasts. And it was so even a year and a half ago, like monetization felt synonymous with advertising. And what's happened in the past year is people are realizing, wow, there's a ton of investment in the space. You're starting to see the inklings of people making exclusive content. And also content creators are saying like, wow, like I could really diversify revenue streams here. There are way more ways to make money, and they're really intrigued and interested and excited about this idea of having listeners pay them directly. And so I think one of the early challenges was like convincing people that I thought this is where the industry is going. And luckily the industry helped and is continuing helping like catch up and help solve that challenge. And so, the educational aspect of it, or maybe the vision setting aspect of it was one of the earliest challenges as a company. And I think it's still something we're getting better and better at, like sort of showing people where this is going.
So let's take a step back and explain for any listeners that may not know exactly what Glow is, or may have heard a little me describe it a little bit in the intro. But can you explain for two audiences, for podcasters who may not have heard of Glow, and then if you had to explain Glow to someone who's not a podcaster, how would you do both of those?
Yeah, for the podcasters out there, or for anyone, Glow is designed to be the best way for podcasters to be able to let listeners pay them directly. And it could either be for listener support or to actually charge for content. We distinguish ourselves in a few ways. One is we are purpose-built for podcasting. So yes, there are a lot of tools out there where people can accept payments. We built one that is specifically designed to capture a listener from the point where they hear their call to action in the audio, to make it as easy as possible for them to pay and access that premium content in whatever podcast app they're listening to within 30 seconds. So we are purpose-built for podcasting and making it really easy for your listeners to pay you. The second thing we do is we are purpose-built for people who think of their podcast or their content as a business. And so we really focus on putting the podcaster's branding first, making it easy to create a pretty lightweight branding experience for your listeners, and also making the whole transaction process as frictionless as possible and helping customize that for you. And so that's what we do for podcasters. So we work with podcasts big and small to help them support their listener support or premium content programs. Our largest creators making upwards of $40,000 a year just by charging for premium content today. And we're continuing growing, working with more and more podcasts who are interested in building a really robust membership, subscription, or just paid content program. For listeners or people who aren't podcasters, Glow is an easy way for you to support or pay the content creators that you love directly. And so, something that you might not know if you're not a podcaster yourself is monetization is a huge problem in the industry. And the average podcast that you listen to, so every podcast listen you get, on average, that makes the industry 1 penny. So you might listen to an hour of content, that makes the industry 1 penny. Best in class, 4 pennies. Like the podcasts that do a really good job of monetizing. What that means is, every 1,000 listeners that a podcaster is getting, they on average make $10. And some do better, some do worse than that. But really, one of the biggest problems in the industry is that a lot of people are creating great content, but they're not making a lot of money. And there's going to be a rise in a lot of different options for people to pay for content or pay creators directly. And we want to be the tip of the spear of that wave and make it really easy for you to do so.
Can you talk a little bit about how the technology works for folks that are familiar with consuming podcasts on their favorite podcast app? How does that change, or what is the experience like when I'm listening to a podcast and I see the Glow.fm link in the show notes?
Yeah, so here's the experience of your listener. You'll hear a call to action from Harry or your favorite podcaster, and they say, if you love what you do and you want more, we have a special premium subscription that you can offer and get more of the content that you love, or maybe an ad-free version of the content you love. Click on this link in the show notes. What happens is a page pops up. It feels like you've never left the app, and you sort of see what you're getting. It's just like any checkout page. You just press tap to check out, and you pay using Apple or Google Pay. Really seamless. You don't have to create a login or anything like that. And then you're taken to another page that has a link of podcast players. So Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Breaker, wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. You choose the player that you want to listen in. So let's say it's Apple Podcasts. Great. Press done. And then in your Apple Podcast library, alongside all your other podcasts, you see that private exclusive content that's just for you, that's not easily searchable in your iTunes store, but you can listen to it everywhere else that your podcasts are. And so for listeners, the idea is to make the journey as simple as possible. We're not trying to change listener behavior. We're not trying to get you to download a new app. We're not trying to get you to create a new login for another service. We just want to make it really easy for you to get the option to check out and pay. And if a podcaster, you want to offer premium content, for you to offer that premium or exclusive content wherever your listener is.
Sounds pretty easy and pretty straightforward.
Yeah, so it's built to be incredibly easy.
What were some of the technical challenges putting something like that together?
Yeah, so basically, the biggest questions around podcasting and why the space can be really difficult to innovate in is two reasons. One is traditionally most of the listening in the space has been done through the Apple Podcast app. Now it's changing. It's becoming a more disaggregated environment. But what that means is, the listening data exists across a lot of different places. And a lot of that data was traditionally held by Apple. So it's really difficult for podcasters to sort of understand what listening looks like. So that's thing one is listener information exists everywhere. Now, from privacy perspective, that's actually great. Like as a listener, you're like, I'm not, my data's not being sold off somewhere, but it's made it difficult for podcasting to piggyback off some of the other business models that have made other mediums thrive in the internet era. Thing two is podcasts are distributed through something called an RSS feed. Now, RSS feed is an internet protocol that's existed since, close to the beginning of the internet that basically makes it really easy to tie together pieces of content in a list form and serve that out. And so one of my favorite closed down products was Google Reader. Google Reader made it really easy to pick up RSS feeds and create sort of a seamless experience where you could browse your favorite content. Podcasts are all RSS feeds. So they are, a link to a page that has sublinks to a bunch of different pieces of content, audio content. And that's how it's served out across different podcast players. The benefits of that, it's an open protocol. It's existed since the beginning of podcasting, or since the beginning of the internet, basically, and it's relatively simple to serve out content. The downsides of it is it's sort of one, I don't know if you could call it protocol or distribution system, but RSS sort of works in one way, and it has limitations and boundaries in terms of how you could set something up in terms of the HTML of the page. So when we're thinking about Glow, the biggest technical limitations are, all right, like, we want to be able to reach listeners wherever they listen. We don't want to make them download a new app. So we're like, all right, we got to exist within the current podcasting ecosystem where people are listening across a number of different apps. And two, we got to work within the current podcasting ecosystem where content gets distributed via RSS feed. And so we had boundaries that we had to operate within. Those are the early technical challenges. It's like those boundaries set up constraints. What's cool is once we better understand those boundaries, like we realize like, oh man, there's some like really interesting opportunities here, right? There are ways that you can play around with RSS protocol to do really cool things. And I know you're playing around with those, Harry, with like things like chapters and even adding images to RSS feeds. Like there's lots of cool next level stuff that can be done. And now that the constraint's been set, it's just about understanding that technology well enough that you can start to figure out like what those next level things are.
What has you most excited about the future of Glow in terms of features or industries or use cases for the application?
I think, so first things first is like, I'm just really excited to help give podcasters a new way to be able to make money. And my personal goal is I want to be able to create 1,000 new podcasting entrepreneurs, of people who can start to seriously take their podcast either full-time or really part-time, in the very near future. And so that's first things first is like help podcasters make some money. But also, one of the most interesting things about this journey is I realize podcasting is one form of medium, but there's a ton of content creators out there, and audio is a way that content creators can use to get their content across, and it's booming right now because of podcasting, but a lot of people are still sort of intimidated by podcasting. And so what I'm excited about is the opportunity for Glow to help content creators who have built proficiencies in other mediums and are now starting to explore podcasting and give them a real option for figuring out another way to monetize the amazing content they've already created. And these folks exist everywhere. They're on YouTube, they're Instagrammers, they're teachers, they're coaches. There's tons of folks out there creating really valuable content. And what we want to do is help make it possible for them to develop a whole new revenue stream. So those are sort of the two things I'm most excited about. In terms of features, in the very near term, we're going to roll out some exciting features that make it really possible for anyone not just to run their exclusive content program through Glow, but to run their entire membership program through Glow. So you can add on, things like newsletters, things like exclusive access to communities. Like we're building that platform. So that's in the near term. But in the long term, those two big goals are the ones that I'm most pumped about.
Are you seeing an increase in the adoption rate or the use, or just people kicking the tires with Glow now that more and more people are becoming aware of it?
Yeah, we're seeing really, really awesome growth. I can't share numbers, but I think what's been really fun is to see this thing grow from one podcast a year ago to tons more on the platform. And I think the most exciting thing is like all the different use cases we're seeing. I didn't realize, Glow could be just an awesome platform for people to share out biographies or to direct to consumer publish audiobooks or fitness coaching. And so what's fun is like now that we started to unlock the possibilities of what someone could do with it, and we are able to pitch those possibilities to content creators, like we're starting to see like a real tick up in adoption. And I really think 2020 is going to be the year where the idea of a paid podcast goes from, like I would never pay for a podcast to, oh yeah, these are normal. And like I paid for that. That thing's awesome.
Very cool. What else about the industry in general has got you excited?
I'm curious to hear your answer to this, Harry, but I think the fact that so many people are paying attention and there's a ton of people paying attention to the space and frankly, like a lot of competition in the space.
Yeah.
It means that it's going to grow a ton and the options out there for content creators and listeners are going to grow exponentially in the next 2 to 3 years. Like I don't love competition, but I kind of love competition because what it does is it forces me to be like, how can we excel? How can we kick ass in this space? And like, what can we do that no one else is paying attention to? And the fact that there are, hundreds or thousands of other sort of companies blossoming in podcasting or in content creation that are looking at podcasting that are thinking the same thing means that you're just going to see a lot of creativity pop up in the next 1 or 2 years. And the industry is going to look very, very different by the end of the year 2021.
Yeah, I've noticed it myself. I've only been doing it for about 5 years, since 2014. And so there's a couple of OGs that I've interviewed who've been doing it since, I think it's 2006 or so, when the first ones came out. But I think it's the marriage of the cultural interest in podcasting with the availability of the technologies now that's making things super interesting. Because just in the conversations I'm having on this podcast, I'm just having more of those with folks who are innovating in the podcasting space. And I've had a couple conversations with Andrew Mason, the former CEO of Groupon, who's got Descript now, and they just acquired Lyrebird. And there's the amount of money that's going into this space with interesting technologies to help podcasters and the podcasting ecosystem has been really fun to watch. And I think it's just exponentially going to get even more fun and more interesting. And then to your point, in the next year or two.
Yeah, and there's tons of room to grow. Like I look at these stats periodically, and I think it's like around 20% of Americans listen to podcasts on a weekly basis today, which is insane growth from last year, 2014. 90% of Americans listen to terrestrial radio on a weekly basis today. So it's like, yeah, the industry's grown a ton, but like, holy shit, like there's so much more room. So, and every, one of those millions more people is more opportunity. So I think the growth is really cool.
Couple of questions as we wrap up. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
That's a good question. Here's an interesting one, actually, is we put out a piece about a month ago on the size of the podcast live events market. It's something that we're really interested in. And, we did what I think is like the first market sizing to figure out podcast live events and how much it's growing. And one of the cool things that came out was the former chief economist of Spotify reached out and said like, hey, I think this is really interesting. Like we're really stoked about the growth of the space. And so we've had some good conversations with them. And I think I had honestly been quite skeptical of the entrance of Spotify and major platforms in podcasting. And after these conversations, I think what it's made me realize is like, there's so much advantage to having someone who is a major platform who has tons of room to invest and tons of room to investigate and tons of time to ask these big questions in the space. Because he's able, let's say, if we have a question like, how do podcasting live events impact listenership? Now, that's a research question I would have just written off, right? Mm-hmm. He's able to look into it, and Spotify's interested in looking into it. And cool. So I think having these bigger platforms in the space that are really invested in the growth of it, I think are going to help grow monetization in ways that we never would have thought of before, because they're able to answer the questions that we just haven't been able to, and I think they're engaged and willing to help make that information public and share it.
That's fascinating, and I don't think I've seen that report from you guys yet, but I definitely want to.
I'll send it over. Yeah.
Yeah. Dig into that. But anything that whole state of the industry, the stuff that Edison Research does. I think it's really fascinating stuff. And I think to your point, the more we understand the ecosystem, I think it'll just open up opportunities, and savvy entrepreneurs will figure out like there's a need that can be served by a lot of this information that's coming out in a way that gets podcasters in the hands of more people, and or even just educating folks into the benefit of podcasts and of live events. And so that's fascinating that you guys have started to have that conversation.
Yeah, it was really a lot of fun, and I was like, man, this is cool. Like I'm pumped about just a million other questions we can start to answer now.
Very cool. What is the most misunderstood thing about you?
I don't have a great answer to that. Probably because I guess I should have a better understanding of the way I'm perceived versus the way I am. So I don't know is the answer. I think one thing that I've realized that is orthogonally related to your question is perhaps I don't have a good answer to what's misunderstood about me because I've done a poor job communicating my opinions and who I am. And I think one of the things I've realized in the past year about starting a company and you're temporarily staying away from podcasting to start that company is I really miss the opportunity to share my voice and tell my stories. And so there's not much people can misunderstand because I haven't given them the opportunity to understand me enough to even have a misunderstanding. And so, yeah, one of my goals is to get out there more and to share my voice more and get back into podcasting. So I hope by this time next year, I'll have a good answer to that question. Maybe that can be my resolution is have something people can misunderstand about me because I've given them the chance to. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just one of those questions that it's a conversation starter, if anything. So I'm always intrigued by the answers people give. So
I'd be intrigued by your answer to it.
That's in the bonus content for Glow subscribers.
Yes.
I just did that on the spot right now. So nice product placement there. So
great.
Well, Amira, I was so looking forward to this conversation, and you definitely did not disappoint. And it turned out even better than I imagined. I'm glad. I appreciate you sharing your story as well. I think that's always fascinating for listeners to hear the background and what makes you. And so I appreciate you taking the time to come on and telling the story of Glow.
Well, thank you for the chance. This is a really fun conversation, and it went places I didn't think it would. But those are always probably the most fun parts of someone's identity. So I'm excited to hear the feedback.
So glow.fm for folks looking to sign up and test out the service. And are there a couple of places you can direct people to if they want to connect with you, or any other sites you want to share?
Yeah, Glow. So check out glow.fm, and you can email me directly. We can put the link in the show notes as well, or distribute it out. But it's just Amira, Amira, at glow.fm, and you should feel free to shoot me a note. Thanks again for your time, and have a fantastic day. Thanks, Harry. Wow, that was a lot of fun. Definitely a stimulating conversation with Amira. Learned a lot about what drives her, about her background, how that influenced her decisions, and how that led her to create Glow. I've been digging these conversations with these amazing leaders in the podcasting space, as well as these ongoing conversations with podcast hosts. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to mix those up, and I hope you're enjoying them as well. Always looking for positive feedback. Full show notes available at podcastjunkies.com/210. Don't forget to check out the glow.fm link in the show notes that was referenced in this episode. Any help in the support and the production of this podcast is always appreciated. It's been a passion project for the past 5 years now. And I'm eternally grateful to all the sponsors who have made an appearance on here and all the positive feedback and reviews I continue to get. Special shout out to Timothy Kim O'Brien, who wrote recently on Podchaser. One of my favorite go-to places for reviews now is Podchaser. Make sure you check out my interview with Cole Raven, co-founder of Podchaser. Timothy writes, Harry is the classic interviewer that really does his homework and has his finger on the pulse of the podcast world. Each and every episode introduces his listeners to a podcaster who we may have missed but deserves to be heard. Harry is approachable in person as well as through his podcast and business. This isn't just another interview show. Harry is the guy to know if you want to meet people doing great shows. I've personally recommended him to my real life friends, and we use him as an example in our monthly meetups. Take a listen. You can thank me later. And I'm going to thank him now. Thanks so much, Timothy, for that heartwarming review. Again, on Podchaser. Grateful for that.
I'll be making a more concerted effort to make sure I read out some of these on these episodes as well. I'm working on a couple of interviews for next week, so I'm not sure which one is actually going to be in next week, so we'll hold off on teasing that one out. Music by Cedar and Soil. Make sure you check them out at cedarandsoil.com. So grateful for the long journey George and I have been on, even though he may not remember it, but helping me out with that music when this show got started. I'm eternally grateful to him for that. As always, thanks to our sponsors, Focusrite, and the beautiful line of 2i2 sound cards, full production and show notes, courtesy of FullCast. And you've made it this far, so you're ready for the first retention hashtag of 2020. Let's go with Amira Glow, and you can tag myself at podcast_junkies and Amira at Amira Valliani to let us know you're a true podcast junkie who's made it to the end of this episode, the first one of 2020. Wishing you all an amazing start to your new year, and we'll catch you next week.